right, here we are. Welcome to week 3 lecture video, Hamlet, Acts 1 and 2, or How Do We Know What We Know? Okay, so Hamlet, here we are. This is arguably Shakespeare's greatest masterpiece. If Shakespeare had only written Hamlet and not a single other play, it's possible that we would still consider him, the greatest living playwright, English author of all time. If Shakespeare had written all his other plays, but not Hamlet, maybe unclear. Jury's out. I mean, the rest of his plays are great and fun, and I like most of them more than Hamlet, but it's unclear if he would still be considered the greatest playwright of all time, because Hamlet is, without doubt, the height of his career, the masterpiece that has lasted centuries. So Hamlet was written around 1600, probably first performed around 1600. And I already spent some time in the week 1 lecture talking about the extremely complicated textual history of Hamlet. I mean, we have multiple variations of this play. We have the bad first quarto, this one right here, which is shorter, more cut up. We have the good second quarto, which is longer. It's very different. And then we have the folio version, which has a lot of overlap with the second quarto, but also has some very different speeches, and just tons and tons of differences between all of these versions. So what are we to make of all of these variations, and which one do we usually read? Some people argue that the bad first quarto, that shorter one, is most likely a version that was performed on the stage, a version that was cut and adapted to be performed on the stage. The second quarto is long, much longer, and to fully act it out takes about 4 hours. So there is a popular argument out there that the long version was never meant to be performed, but only to go into print and be read. And this is a super interesting argument for people who, that whole debate we talked about, whether Shakespeare only wrote for performance or whether he was a literary author too, with readers in mind. So some people argue that this longer version of Hamlet is proof that he wrote for a reading audience, that this long version of Hamlet never would have been put on the stage. So to counter that argument, there is a lot of evidence, especially prior to the early modern period, where during festivals and certain, they were called play cycles and pageants, that was sort of the history of English theater. Some of those plays, some of those earlier plays in medieval times, would stretch for an entire day and into an evening. So we're talking, 12, 18-hour plays. So that was still going on into Shakespeare's days. These long play cycles, these long pageants, or this idea that when people went to the playhouse, it was an event and they expected it to take up most of their day. It was in the afternoons. And so it is not impossible to consider, imagine, or conceive that an early modern audience would have been okay sitting through a 4-hour play, on their day off work. We, however, in modern times, have been conditioned to have a much shorter attention span. It's painful for us to sit through a full production of Hamlet. So any version you see on stage is likely to have been cut substantially. And you can actually see the difference here in these 2 film productions of Hamlet from the 90s. Okay, so Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet from 1995, he stayed very faithful to the text, and it ends up being a full 4 hours, 4 hours and 2 minutes, his version of Hamlet. Compare that to the Mel Gibson Hamlet from 1990, which is 2 hours and 15 minutes. So obviously this one's been cut substantially and very much shortened. And I'm not saying that this is the sole reason why, but commercially, Gibson's Hamlet was much more successful than Branagh's. And as a full confession, I haven't seen either of these versions. That's still on my to-do list to watch these versions of Hamlet. So I can't personally speak to which one's better, but I will say both of them are star-studded casts. We've got Kate Winslet as Ophelia in Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, which is an interesting choice. But the Mel Gibson Hamlet, that is a very young Helena Bonham Carter as Ophelia and Glenn Close as Queen Gertrude. Anyway, got to see these. Got to see both of these. Okay, but the important point to take away is that when you are reading or watching or listening to any version of Hamlet, you've got to keep this in mind that things are probably going to be cut out, or changed, or altered, or in the case of the text we're reading now from Norton, we're going to be reading a combined version, a hybrid version that takes, it's mostly based off of Q2, Quarto 2, but takes some key speeches from the folio version. And actually, this is a screenshot of the online version of your textbook, and this is how Norton's decided to do it online. So everything in regular font is Q2, and then they highlight the folio editions, the speeches that they're bringing from the folio, they highlight those by italicizing them. And you'll notice that there's the textual comment box out to the side that you can click on, and it explains everything about where they're drawing this from the folio and why they've decided to insert it here. All right, let's talk about source material for Hamlet, because I think this is interesting. So your introduction mentioned there's this really tantalizing hints and references to a play from the late 1580s or early 1590s that was called Hamlet. And we refer to this as the Hamlet, or the potentially the original Hamlet. We don't know anything about it. We know very little about it. We know that it has been completely lost, so we don't have any copies of it today. And people have made guesses about who the author was. I think the most popular, the most popular guess right now is Sir Thomas Kidd, who was a very early innovator in theater and was very influential on Shakespeare. So that play, that original Hamlet, may have been the actual source text for Shakespeare's Hamlet, but we don't really know. I do, however, think it's pretty interesting to consider the play in the context of the original Danish tale of Hamlet, and your introduction talked about this original Danish tale. So we don't necessarily know if Shakespeare read the original Danish tale, if that was his main source material, or if the lost play was his main source material. But it's possible. It's possible that one or either or both, right? Now, your introduction points out some key and interesting differences between the stories of this Danish legend, Hamlet, and Shakespeare's play. So in the Danish version, Hamlet knows from the beginning that his father was murdered. This is public knowledge. There's no question about this. There's no need for a ghost to inform him about this. It's just fairly understood. So by the time we get to 1600 England and Shakespeare's version of Hamlet, this is the key interesting thing that has changed. All of a sudden, this knowledge, or what is known, or what is knowable, it's much more in doubt. It's much more questionable. The fact that the king was murdered is not public knowledge. So Hamlet had been away at school in a place called Wittenberg, which was a hub of intellectual and religious activity in early modern Europe. This is the little German town where Martin Luther basically kicked off the whole Protestant Reformation, which, if you know anything about your religious history, was a pretty big moment of questioning authority and questioning received truth, okay? Um, you'll also notice that Hamlet uses the word philosophy a few times, speaking to Horatio and others, and that's philosophy, a pursuit of knowledge and wisdom. That's what he would have been studying in Wittenberg, along with these possibly Protestant religious ideas and thoughts. So one of the newest types of philosophy that sort of grows out of this religious questioning and just developments in intellectual thought all around, one of this newest types of philosophy being explored in post-medieval Europe was something we call epistemology. Now, the word epistemology wasn't actually used until the 1800s, or invented until the 1800s. But this is something, it was still an exploration that was happening. And epistemology is the philosophical exploration of the origins, the limits, and the nature of human knowledge. Okay, so in other words, people began asking questions like, what do we know for sure? And how do we know it? How can we trust that what we know is true? So in the medieval period, to take this back to sort of the religious side of things, where knowledge came from, when knowledge, it came from a place of authority, right? The authority of the church, the authority of the priest, right? And that is where all knowledge came from, or it came from tradition or custom. This is just what the collective people know, and we've always known it because of tradition or custom. And generally, things are just simply accepted as true because a person in authority has told you it's true. Okay. But as we get into the early modern period, as we get into this religious Reformation era, people begin to question quite a bit more about where knowledge comes from and how we can actually know for sure that something is true. And we get the very early beginnings of the development of the scientific method. So one of the prevailing arguments was, can our senses be trusted? Or it was this idea that that is one way to confirm knowledge, right? Through your senses. If you're able to see it, if you're able to hear it, if you're able to feel it, then it exists, then it must be real, then it must be true. That's how we can get knowledge. But of course, there were, yes, the problems with that is that your senses can be fooled sometimes. They can be tricked. There can be illusions. And so if you can't really trust your senses 100% all the time, then what can you trust? And how can we prove that something's true? So these are sort of ideas that are circulating in the early modern period. And Shakespeare sometimes called a natural philosopher, in that Shakespeare himself didn't go to a university. He didn't necessarily study philosophy in depth, but he does seem to have a finger on the pulse of big ideas that are being explored, because he does a lot of reading and whatnot. So in the background of this play, Hamlet is grappling with this sort of large philosophical question of epistemology. How can he know what is true in this play? How can he know if his uncle really murdered his father? That's a big if. That wasn't a question in the original Danish legend, but it's a big question in this play. So a ghost tells him. And at first blush, this seems like pretty convincing evidence. Other people saw the ghost, so that's sort of confirmation that the ghost was real, maybe. The ghost was convincing in his visual and verbal cues. He looked like his dead father. He was able to say things that convinced Hamlet that he was a trustworthy authority, and Hamlet seems to believe him, right? But then he sees the ghost in the first act, and the ghost tells him to revenge him, but then Hamlet doesn't actually do anything. right? Through all of Act 2, Hamlet really doesn't do anything at all. He doesn't avenge his father. He doesn't act on this knowledge. Why? And we kind of come to find out that it's because he's really uncertain about the knowledge. He's uncertain about whether he can trust the ghost. He's uncertain about this this perceived source of authoritative knowledge. And he's just doubting. He's doubting if his uncle really did kill him. And even if his uncle did kill his father, he is doubtful and unsure about what the proper way to respond is. His father tells him, the ghost of his father tells him to revenge him, to kill his uncle, but Hamlet still just has all sorts of questions about how can he know that that's actually the right thing to do. So Hamlet is continuously looking for other sources of knowledge, other ways of confirming and learning and finding things out. And so you'll notice in his famous soliloquy at the end of Act 2, this is where we finished up for this week, he devises another plan for ascertaining truth in the question of whether his uncle actually murdered his father. He's going to have the actors, those actors that showed up, that troupe of actors, he's going to have them stage a play that acts out the scene of the murder. And he's going to see how his uncle responds. And so if his uncle responds to the play with guilt, then Hamlet will know it's true. That will be the evidence he's looking for. The question is, will it? Will that be evidence? Is that really a trustworthy source of evidence? Will it work? We'll have to see next week when we read Act 3 and read about the play scene. It's also called the mousetrap scene. It's a very, very famous scene, so we'll definitely need to talk about it. But just that famous last line, the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. This idea that Hamlet has landed on another source, and it's ironic, not ironically, it's very Shakespearean for it to be a dramatic source for obtaining knowledge. That through this artifice of the play and an audience reaction to a play, Hamlet will be able to discern some element of truth about reality. But this question of epistemology, of what is knowable given scant evidence, it's not just a question for Hamlet the character, it's also a question for the audience of this play. So the audience, watching it or reading it, we are constantly asking, what is real in this play? And what is actually going on? And how do we know what is going on in Hamlet's mind? That is one of the big questions. What is up with Hamlet? What is his motivation? What is he doing? Why is he acting the way he's acting? Is he actually mad? Is he crazy? Right? In the first act, he doesn't seem mad, and then he hears the ghost and tells Horatio that he's planning to have an antic disposition, meaning that his madness might be a little bit feigned. But then you get to Act 2, and you're just like, Hamlet, what is up with you? What are you doing? Is this an act? Is this fake? Is this real? Are you sane? Are you crazy? Are you going crazy? And even Hamlet's parents are preoccupied. Well, parents, his uncle, now stepfather, and his mom are preoccupied with this question too, to the point that they set spies on Hamlet. That's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, his two buddies from school that they call in and tell him, hey, we need you guys to sort of hang out with Hamlet and figure out what's going on. And then we also have these other questions to deal with. What is up with Ophelia? What is up with Hamlet and Ophelia? What is that relationship? What is going on there? Are they in love? Was he ever in love? Was he just leading her on? Does she actually love him? What is going on, right? What is real and how do we know it's real? And it's frustrating because it feels like Shakespeare could have answered some of these questions. It feels like he could have made things more clear. He could have laid it out cleanly. In fact, we get a number of these soliloquies where Hamlet is directly addressing the audience and explaining what's his thought process is, right? And you would think that these soliloquy moments would be illuminating. They would tell us exactly what's going on in Hamlet's head. But here is the genius of this play. Um, nobody no answers come out. Nothing is for sure. Hamlet himself may not even know what's going on in his head. He may not be aware at all of what's motivating him or what's driving him or why he's acting the way he's acting. This is debated, but I think one of the interesting ways of looking at this play is that it is a deeply psychological play, that it is the big question of what is going on inside these people? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? And how do we know? And how do they know? How do they even know? How can you know what you're actually thinking and feeling? And that is what makes this play so incredibly genius. Really, it's why this play has lasted this long. It is that ambiguity, exactly that ambiguity. This knowing but not knowing, right? This tantalizing multiplicity of ways of interpreting these characters and their motivations and what's going on with it. And you will see versions of this play that try to provide some more solid answers. They will interpret, Hamlet and Ophelia's relationship in a certain way and make it seem like it absolutely is this way. But then you'll see other productions which do complete opposite. And the text allows for that because that is the beauty of this text, that it is ambiguous, that it is hard to know anything for certain, and that's sort of isn't that life, right? Hard to know for certain what is actually going on, and these are the questions that we're always grappling with. How do we know? How do we know what is real and what is true? And is it even possible? Is it even possible? So I'm going to leave it there for now, but I want us to keep thinking about these questions and these ideas of epistemology as we read through the rest of this play next week. Oh yeah, so the skull. We'll get to the skull next week, guys. If you've ever seen Hamlet before, you've probably seen him with the skull. That's the big symbol of Hamlet in this play. That hasn't shown up yet. We'll get to that next week, and we'll have to make sure we talk about that scene. But keep going, keep thinking, and think deeply about what you think is actually going on in this play.